In the winter of 1891, a man walked into the county seat 40 miles east of Ashcombe Hollow and asked the clerk to strike the whole town from the records, not because a fire had taken it. The mine had not closed, and no flood had come down the creek. He said the town had been counted wrong for years, and that the counting had finally caught up with everyone in it. The clerk wrote down what he could before the man stopped talking and would not start again. Ashcombe Hollow does not appear on any map printed after that spring. The road that led to it was left to grow over, and the grass took it back inside of 10 years. The people who had lived above the hollow, the ones who survived that winter, spent the rest of their lives refusing to say how many neighbours they had really had, or where the rest of them had gone. Before we go any further, do one thing for me. Type the word hollow in the comments below. It tells me you are the kind of person who follows a story all the way to the bottom, and it tells the algorithm to carry this one further than the county ever let it travel. One word is all it takes. Then stay with me, because the deeper we go, the stranger the counting gets. To understand what happened in the hollow, you have to understand the ground it sat on. The Ozark country in southern Missouri is not solid the way people imagine solid ground to be. It is limestone, soft and old, and water has been moving through it for longer than there have been people to notice. Over thousands of years that water carves the rock from the inside. It hollows out rooms and long halls and throats of stone that run for miles beneath the hills, and it does all of this in the dark, where no one can watch it happen. A man standing in a field there might have 40 feet of open air below his boots and never know a thing about it. The springs are what give it away. All through that country the water comes up cold and sudden out of the rock, and where it comes up the settlers built their towns. Ashcombe Hollow was one of those places. The families who founded it came in the 1840s, drawn first by the promise of lead in the hills and then by the springs, which never froze and never failed even in the driest part of the summer. They named the settlement for the ash trees that grew thick along the valley floor, and they called the valley a hollow because that is what the old people called any low place folded down between the hills. Nobody who named it meant anything darker by the word. That came later, and it came slowly, the way the worst things always seem to arrive. The town did well enough for a mining town. There was a church with a squat stone foundation, a schoolhouse, a general store, and 2 crooked streets of houses that ran along the creek. The lead never made anyone rich, but the springs made the ground good for gardens and for stock, and the families stayed. By the 1860s there were perhaps 300 people living in the hollow, which was a fair size for that corner of the state. They buried their dead on the hill above the church, in a small yard fenced with iron. Marriages happened within the valley more often than outside it. They passed the same handful of names down through the generations, the way isolated places always do, until half the town was cousin to the other half. But there were things about the hollow that the families did not put into their letters back east. The first was the sound. On still nights, when the wind died down and the creek ran low over its stones, people in the houses closest to the church could hear something underneath the ground. It was never loud. It was a kind of settling, a slow shifting, like a great weight turning over somewhere far below the floor of the valley. The old people said it was only the springs working through the rock, and for a long time that explanation was enough to let everyone sleep. But the springs ran all year, and the sound did not. It came in the cold months, when the water was lowest, and it came from beneath the church, and it did not sound like water to anyone who lay awake in the dark and truly listened to it. The second thing was the wells. Ashcombe Hollow had good springs, but the houses on the higher ground still dug wells, and those wells behaved in ways that wells should not. A bucket dropped down them would sometimes come back up before it should have, as though the bottom were closer than the digging had suggested. Other times the rope would run out to its very end and never strike water at all. Children were warned away from the well behind the schoolhouse, and not because they might fall in. They were warned because of what came up out of it on certain nights. A draught of air would rise from the shaft, warm when the whole surface world was frozen hard, and it carried a smell that the older women could only describe as the smell of too many people shut up together in a closed room. The third thing, the thing that no one in the hollow ever spoke of directly, was that the town never emptied the way other towns emptied. Families left. That much was ordinary. In every mining town, some seasons the work dried up, and people packed their wagons and moved on toward better prospects, and their houses stood dark behind them. But in Ashcombe Hollow, the dark houses did not stay dark for long, and the families who moved into them were not families that anyone remembered arriving. A lamp would appear in a window that had been cold for a month. Smoke would climb from a chimney that no wagon had ever pulled up to. When the neighbours asked after these new people, the answers were always thin and vague. They came in at night. Mostly they kept to themselves. They did not come to church, and they did not come to the store. And yet the town, somehow, was never any smaller than it had been the season before. This is the part that a census taker first noticed in the spring of 1891, a man the surviving accounts remember only by his surname, Merrick, who was sent out by the state to count the living souls of the hollow. He was not the first man to count Ashcombe Hollow. The counts had been done every 10 years, the way they were done everywhere, and the earlier men had come and gone without ever noticing a thing wrong. But Merrick was thorough where the others had been lazy, and Merrick did something that none of them had thought to do. He set his count of the living against the count of the dead on the hill, and he set both of those against the older counts that sat gathering dust in the county ledgers going back 40 years. The numbers did not close. They did not even come near to closing. Too few people had ever left the hollow to account for the gaps. Too few had ever died and been laid in the iron-fenced yard above the church. And yet the town on the surface had not grown across all those years. If anything, it had quietly shrunk. Houses that stood occupied in 1 week of his count stood cold and abandoned in the next, their families simply gone, with no wagon tracks leading out of the valley, and no fresh graves dug to explain the absence. Merrick counted the living twice and arrived at 2 different numbers. He counted the headstones on the hill and found names carved there that he could not match to any family the townspeople would admit to remembering. And when he finally sat down with the oldest ledgers and worked the arithmetic that no man in 40 years had bothered to work, he reached a conclusion that he wrote down once, in a hand that grew unsteady toward the end of the line, and then spent the rest of his life trying to take back. The people of Ashcombe Hollow were disappearing. They had been disappearing steadily for 2 full generations, and something down in the dark was keeping the town above it full. He did not yet know where the missing were going. He would learn that in time, and what he learned would send him to the county seat that winter, begging a clerk to erase a town from the face of the earth. But before we follow Merrick down into what he found, you have to understand exactly how the counting failed, because the slow shrinking of Ashcombe Hollow is the thread that every other part of this story hangs from. Before we move on to the descent, stop for a second. What you just heard about the town that kept shrinking is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the full account. The population count, the names that stopped appearing. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The failure of the counting began, as far as anyone can now reconstruct it, with the ledgers themselves. Merrick spent the better part of a week in the front room of the general store with those old books spread across a plank table, and the storekeeper watched him do it with an expression that the census taker later described as something between pity and warning. The ledgers recorded births in one column and deaths in another, and beside them the storekeeper's own accounts recorded who had bought flour and lamp oil and nails across the decades, which was a kind of second census that no official had ever thought to keep. Merrick had the good sense to read both, and when he read them side by side, he found that the 2 records told stories that could not both be true. The births were there. Ashcombe Hollow bore children at the ordinary rate of any farming town, and the church register recorded their baptisms in a careful hand. The deaths were there too, though they were fewer than a town of that size should have produced across 40 years, and Merrick noted this and set it aside as a curiosity for the moment. What could not be reconciled was the middle of a life. A child would be born and baptized and recorded in the storekeeper's accounts as the family bought a second cradle or a larger pair of boots each year, and then, somewhere between the child's 8th year and its 12th, the accounts for that family would simply thin out and stop. No death was recorded. No wedding carried the child's name into a new household. The family did not leave, because the storekeeper's accounts showed the parents still buying, still living, still ordering seed in the spring. Only the child was gone from the arithmetic, as though it had been quietly lifted out of the town's sum, and the books had closed over the space where it had been. Merrick counted these thinned-out families and found more of them than he could easily believe. Across 2 generations, dozens of names had entered the ledgers as infants and never once appeared again as adults. They had not died, none had married, they had not left. The town had simply grown smaller by exactly that many people, and the town had never noticed, because the town, in the very same span of years, had been keeping itself full by other means. This was the second half of the puzzle, and it was worse than the first. For every child who thinned out of the ledgers, a stranger seemed to have thinned in. New buyers appeared in the storekeeper's accounts, with no baptism behind them and no wagon before them. They ordered oil and flour and nails like anyone else. They paid, when they paid, in old coin that the storekeeper set apart in a separate box because it did not spend easily, being older than the town and worn smooth beyond reading. And when Merrick asked the storekeeper to describe these customers, to name a single one of them, the man went quiet for a long moment and then said only that they came to the counter at dusk, that they never came in full daylight, and that he had learned across 30 years of business not to look too long at their hands. Their hands. Merrick pressed on that, and the storekeeper would say no more about it than that the fingers were too many, or too long, or too pale. He could never afterward decide which, only that a man's eye slid off them the way a foot slides off wet stone, and that it was better for everyone if it did. The census-taker did not believe him. That is important to understand about Merrick, and it is the reason his account carries any weight at all across the distance of years. He was not a superstitious man. Across a dozen counties he had heard every kind of a country story, of haunted mills, and of witches in the hills, and of lights that walked the marshes at night, and he had learned to write down what the ledgers said, and to leave the stories to the people who needed them. He believed the storekeeper was frightened, and he believed the fear was real, but he did not yet believe there was anything under the ground worth being frightened of. He believed, at first, that the town was hiding something ordinary, a pattern of killings, perhaps, covered up across generations. Children sold, or given away, or worse, and the guilt of it dressed up in tales of the dark to keep the county from looking too closely. So Merrick began to knock on doors, and this is where the counting stopped being arithmetic and became something else. He went first to the family the ledgers called Alder, because the Alder name appeared more often in the thinned-out column than any other. 5 children entered as infants across 2 generations, and not one of them carried forward into an adult life. The Alder house stood on the higher ground near the schoolhouse, close to the bad well, and when Merrick came up the path, an old woman met him at the door before he had even raised his hand to knock. She had been watching for him. Somehow she knew why he had come, and she did not pretend otherwise. She asked him one question before she would let him speak. She asked him whether he had done the arithmetic yet, and when he admitted that he had, she stepped back from the door and let him in, and she said that in that case there was no longer any use in lying to him, because the arithmetic was the one thing in the hollow that had never learned how. Inside, the old woman told Merrick a version of the story that he would spend the rest of his life failing to disprove. She told him that the families of Ashcombe Hollow had known about the ones below the ground since before the church was built. She told him that the springs were not the only thing that came up out of the rock, and that the town had made an arrangement in its earliest years, an arrangement that no one now living had agreed to, but that no one now living dared to break. And she told him that the arrangement had a price, and that the price was paid in children, and that it had been paid so faithfully for so long that the town above and the town below had grown into a single thing with 2 floors, and that the lower floor was now the larger of the 2. Merrick asked her how she could know such a thing, how anyone could count a population that lived in the dark beneath the valley and never showed itself in daylight. And the old woman told him that she knew because she had been down, that every family in the hollow sent someone down once when they came of age to see the price with their own eyes, so that no one could ever pretend the debt was not real. She had gone down as a girl of 15, 70 years before, carrying a lamp and led by her own grandmother, and she had counted what she could of the halls before her nerve gave out. And she told Merrick that even then, 70 years before, even as a frightened girl who fled back up the stair before she had seen the half of it, she had understood one thing about the place below the hollow that she had never afterward been able to forget. There were more of them down there than there had ever been of us up here, and every year, quietly, in the cold there were more. The old woman's account, on its own, would be easy to set aside as the tale of a frightened mind grown strange with age. Merrick nearly did set it aside, but when he left the alder house and began to walk the valley with new eyes, he found that the land itself agreed with her, and the land is the one witness that does not learn how to lie. The hollow sat in a bowl of hills, and the bowl was rotten underneath. Merrick had seen sinkhole country before, but he had never seen it worked the way Ashcombe Hollow was worked. Behind the church, screened by a stand of the old ash trees, the ground fell away into a wide throat of stone that the townspeople called the spring mouth, because the cold water came up out of it in a steady flood. But the water only used a corner of the opening. The rest of the throat went down into the dark, dry and wide, and a worn path led along its edge, and the path had been worn by a great many feet across a great many years. Merrick stood at the lip of it and felt the warm air come up against his face, and he understood at once that this was the same warm air the town had smelled rising out of the bad wells, and that the wells and the spring mouth and the sound beneath the church were all openings into the same single space, and that the space was enormous. He learned the rest of the geography from the men who had mined the hills in the early years, or rather from the sons and grandsons of those men, because the miners themselves were mostly gone. The lead in the hills had run in narrow veins, and the miners had followed those veins down into the rock, and more than one crew had broken through the wall of a lead, drift into open blackness on the other side. They had not found more ore. They had found rooms. Rooms with floors worn smooth. Rooms with the marks of tools on the walls that were not the marks of any tool the miners carried. And in the deepest of these breakthroughs, the ones the old men only described in the lowest voice and only when they had been drinking, the miners had found halls. Long straight halls, cut level and true through the living limestone, running off into a dark that their lamps could not begin to fill, with doorways opening from them at regular spaces, on, further than any of them had been willing to walk. The town had sealed those breakthroughs, every one of them. When a crew broke into the halls, the vein was abandoned, and the drift was filled with rubble, and the men were paid to keep their mouths shut. And the ones who could not keep their mouths shut had a way of thinning out of the ledgers like everyone else. This was the town's real industry, Merrick came to understand. Not lead. The lead was only the reason the first families had come. The real work of Ashcombe Hollow, the work that had gone on quietly for 50 years, was the work of keeping the halls sealed everywhere except at the one place where the town had agreed to leave them open, which was the worn path down the spring mouth behind the church, where the price was carried down and paid. Now, everything I am telling you comes to us through the story the survivors told, and through the account Merrick left behind, and no county surveyor ever went down that spring mouth with a chain and a level to map what was truly there. So you are right to hold it at arm's length. A great deal of what people believe about the ground beneath the Ozarks is exactly the kind of tale that grows in the dark of a place and feeds on the fear of the people living over it. I am not asking you to believe that the halls were cut by anything but water and time, or that the doorways were anything but the ordinary shapes that limestone falls into when it dissolves. Reasonable men have stood in wild caves and sworn they were walking the corridors of a buried city, and they were wrong, and the rock had simply fooled the frightened parts of their minds. But I am asking you to sit with what the frightened parts of those minds insisted on across 50 years, from a dozen separate families who had no reason to agree with one another and every reason to keep quiet. They did not describe a cave. A cave is a thing you get lost in, a thing that closes and narrows and drips. What they described, every one of them, was a thing that was built. Level floors, squared corners, doorways at even spaces. And behind the doorways, they said, were rooms. And the rooms were not empty, and the rooms had never been empty, not once in all the years the town had been paying to keep them full. The oldest belief in the hollow, older than the church, was that the ones below had been there first. That the settlers in the 1840s had not come to empty country at all, but had built their town on the roof of an older one, without knowing it, the way a man might raise a cabin on the lid of a well and live his whole life over the water and never guess it was there. In this telling, the price was not a tribute the town chose to pay. It was a rent. The families had built where they had no right to build, over a people who had held that ground since before there were maps to leave it off of, and the ones below had let them stay, and go on staying on the single condition that the debt for the ground be paid in the only coin that mattered to them, which was the young. The future, put plainly, which was, in the cold and patient logic of a people who measured time in the slow dissolving of stone, the one thing that would make certain the town above never outgrew its rent. There is a colder version of the belief, and Merrick heard this one too, from a man who had gone down as a boy and had never afterwards slept a full night through. In the colder version, the ones below were not an older people at all. In the colder version, they were the town. They were the thinned-out children, and the thinned-out children's children, carried down the spring mouth in the cold months and not killed, not sacrificed in any way the word usually means, but kept and changed. Grown in the dark, the way a root cellar grows pale, shoots out of a forgotten potato, until the child that went down was no longer a child that could ever come back up, until it belonged to the halls, and the halls belonged to it, and it took its place in the count below, and swelled that count by one more. In the colder version, the population beneath the hollow was not a separate nation at all. It was every generation the town had ever lost, still down there, still waiting, and still, in some slow and terrible fashion, growing. Merrick did not know which version to believe. Toward the end of his life he seems to have suspected that both were true at once, that the ones below had been there first, and that the town had been feeding itself into them for 50 years, and that the two facts were not in conflict, but were the same fact seen from the top of the stair and from the bottom. But that understanding came later, and it came at a cost, and to reach it he had to do the one thing that every account agrees he swore at first he would never do. He had to go down. Before he went down, Merrick spent his last weeks above ground the way a careful man spends them. He gathered the accounts of the taking, family by family, house by house, because he understood that if he was going to descend, he should first know exactly what had gone down that stair before him, and how, and when. The pattern that came together in his notes across those weeks is the coldest thing in the whole record, colder than the halls, because it is not a tale of monsters at all. It is a tale of ordinary people doing a terrible thing on a schedule, year after year, and telling themselves it was the weather. The taking came in the cold months. That much every family agreed on, and it fit what the town already half knew about the sound beneath the church, which rose only in winter when the springs ran low and the dry halls opened wider under the drained water table. Somewhere in the deep cold, between the first hard freeze and the breaking of the ice, a family that owed the debt would know its turn had come. No message was sent, no elder knocked on the door. The family simply knew, the way you know a tooth has gone bad before it aches, and the knowing settled over the house like a second winter. The parents would grow quiet. The chosen child would be told nothing, or told only that it was going on a journey to kin in another county, and for a few days the household would move through its chores, in a silence that the neighbours recognised and looked away from, because every house on the street had lived inside that silence once and would live inside it again. Then, on a night with no moon, the family would carry the child down the worn path behind the church. They went in the dark on purpose. A lamp was permitted only at the very top of the stair, and it was left burning there at the lip of the spring mouth, so that the ones who carried the child down would have a light to climb back toward, and so that the child, looking back, would see that light shrinking above it and understand at last, too late, what kind of journey it had been brought on. What happened at the bottom, the families would not say. They came back up the stair without the child. The lamp came down with them. They went home. And in the spring, when the census of the storekeeper's accounts is read, that child is simply gone from the sum, and the family orders one less pair of boots, and the town is one smaller and does not shrink, because that same winter a new pale buyer has appeared at the counter at dusk, paying in old coin, keeping its hands below the level of the storekeeper's eyes. Merrick recorded the taking of the older children, all 5, across the 2 generations the old woman had lived through. He recorded a family the ledgers called Pruitt, whose only son was carried down in the winter of 1871, and whose mother was said to have walked up the hill to the burying ground every winter night for the rest of her life, and lain down on the cold grass among the iron fences, and spoken to a grave that had no body under it, because there was no body, because the body was not dead, because the body was below. He recorded the schoolteacher, a young woman who had come to the hollow from outside, and who had not understood the arrangement, and who had begun, in her second winter, to ask the children in her care why so many of the desks had a name scratched into them and no living child to fill them. The schoolteacher thinned out of the ledgers between one term and the next. The desks kept their names, no one filled them. And he recorded the worst winter, the winter that the whole valley still spoke of in 1891, though it had happened only 2 years before, the winter of 1889, when the taking did not come for a single child but for an entire street. Something had gone wrong that year, though no one could say precisely what. Perhaps a family had tried to break the arrangement and run. Perhaps a debt had been allowed to lapse too long, or paid short, or paid grudgingly, and the ones below had decided to collect the whole of what they were owed at once. What the survivors agreed on was this. On the coldest night of that winter, the sound beneath the church did not stay beneath the church. It moved. It came up through the ground and travelled the length of the eastern street, house by house, a slow shifting weight passing under the floors, and where it passed, the lamps in the windows went out, one after another, in order, as though something were reading its way down the street from a list. In the morning the eastern street was empty. 9 houses. Not a body in any of them, not a sign of struggle, not a track in the fresh snow leading out of the valley in any direction. 9 families, better than 40 people all told, simply subtracted from the town between dusk and dawn. And by the following dusk, the survivors swore, there were lamps burning again in some of those same 9 windows, and smoke rising from some of those same 9 chimneys, and no one in the hollow was ever brave enough or foolish enough to go and knock on the doors and ask who had moved in. That was the state of Ashcombe Hollow when Merrick came to count it in the spring of 1891, a town that had eaten itself steadily for 50 years and refilled itself from below, until the census-taker's arithmetic finally cornered the truth that the town had spent 2 generations refusing to add up. The living count would not match the ledgers, because the living count was salted through with the ones who had come up from the halls to keep the number whole. The dead count on the hill was too small because most of the dead were not dead, only taken, only kept, only growing quietly in the dark under the feet of the men who had carried them there. And the whole grim machine ran on a single unspoken rule that Merrick finally set down in plain words in his notes, a rule that explained the sound and the wells and the pale byres and the empty street all at once. The town above was not allowed to grow. That was the rent. Every child the hollow produced beyond what the ones below would permit was carried down the stair and folded into the count that already outnumbered the surface many times over. The town was kept at 300 souls, more or less, forever, not by chance and not by hardship, but by design, held to that number by a landlord who lived in the rock and who was patient in the way that only the very old and the very hungry can afford to be. And Merrick, holding all of this in his hands at last, made the decision that no census-taker before him had made, and that no man who made it ever fully returned from. He decided he would go down the spring mouth himself, in the cold, and count the ones below with his own eyes, because he was a man whose whole life had been built on the belief that a thing you can count is a thing you can prove, and a thing you can prove is a thing that can finally be stopped. Merrick went down on a night in early December, when the springs had drawn back into the rock and the dry halls stood at their widest. He did not go down alone, which is the only reason any account of the descent survives at all. The old woman of the Alder house had a grandson, a young man of about 20, named only in the record as the boy, and the boy agreed to carry the lamp to the lip of the spring mouth and to wait there through the night, and to leave without Merrick if the census-taker had not climbed back up by the first grey light. That was the bargain. 1 man would go down to count, and 1 man would stay at the top to remember, so that whatever happened, the arithmetic would not be lost with the man who went to find it. Merrick carried no lamp of his own past the top of the stair. He had learned the rule, and he obeyed it, though he did not understand it until he was well below, when he came to understand that a light carried into the halls would be seen from a very long way off in that flat and level dark, and that a man who wished to count without being counted in return had better move the way the ones below moved, which was without light, by touch, along the worn smoothness of the walls. So he left the boy's lamp burning at the lip behind him, and he went down into a blackness so complete that after a dozen steps he could not have told you whether his eyes were open or shut, and he counted his descent in paces, and he wrote the number down later, and the number was far larger than the depth of any cave the county had ever recorded. The stair gave way to level ground. Merrick felt it change under his boots, felt the worn slope flatten into a floor that was smooth and true, and cut, he was certain, cut, not dissolved, a floor that had been made level by hands and worn level by feet across a span of time he did not want to imagine. The warm air moved past him steadily now, that same close air the Wells had breathed up into the winter, and it carried the smell the old women had named, the smell of too many people shut together in a closed room, and Merrick understood that he was smelling the breath of the halls, and that a space does not breathe like that unless a great many living things are breathing inside it. He found the first hall by walking into the corner of it. His outstretched hand met a squared edge of stone, an inside corner, clean and deliberate, and he followed it and found that it opened his narrow passage into something vast. The air changed, sound changed. His own careful footsteps, which had come back to him close and flat in the passage, now travelled away from him into a distance and did not return, and he knew he had stepped into a hall so long that his footfalls died before they reached the far end of it. And it was here, standing at the mouth of that first great hall, with his back against the worn stone and his heart going in his chest like a trapped bird, that Merrick saw the lights. They were not lamps, he was certain of that at once, and he was certain of it for the rest of his life. A lamp throws a warm and moving glow, and it casts shadows that jump. These lights did neither. They were low and cold and steady, a pale grey luminance with no clear source, and they hung at intervals down the length of the hall, one after another, receding into a distance that Merrick could not measure, marking out the hall the way lamps mark out a street, except that they gave almost no light at all, only enough to see that there was something to see, only enough to turn the total blackness into a dim grey world of shapes. And by that dim grey light Merrick saw the doors. They ran down both walls of the hall as far as the lights went, and the lights went farther than he could follow. Squared openings at even spaces, exactly as the old miners had sworn, dozens of them within his sight, and, he understood with a slow, cold horror, hundreds beyond it, thousands beyond that, hall opening from hall, the whole rotten bowl of the valley honeycombed with these level corridors and their patient doors, a city with no sky, laid out beneath the feet of a town that had never held more than 300 souls, and in the doorways, and moving slow and silent along the halls between them, and standing motionless against the walls in a stillness that no living man could have held, were the ones below. Merrick tried to count them. That is the detail in his account that I find hardest to read, and the one I most believe, because it is exactly what a man like Merrick would do, and exactly the wrong thing. He stood at the mouth of that first hall, in the dim grey light, with the breath of the halls moving warm across his face, and he began to count the shapes he could see, because counting was the one act his whole life had trained him to reach for in the presence of a thing he could not otherwise bear. He counted the near ones first, the ones in the doorways closest to him, and he got to something above 40 before he understood that the shapes further down the hall were not fewer, only dimmer, and that beyond them were more, and beyond those, more again, and that the hall did not end, and that the counting he had come down to do was a counting that could not be finished by one man in one night or in one life, because there were more of them in that single hall than there had ever been people in the town, and this was one hall, and the halls ran off into a dark that had no far wall that he would ever find. They did not rush him. That is the thing he came back saying, over and over, in the years after, to anyone who would sit with him long enough to hear it. They did not rush him, and somehow that was worse than any rushing would have been. They knew he was there. He was sure of that. The near ones had turned toward him, slowly, the way a field of grain turns when the wind changes, all together and without hurry, their pale faces, or the pale places where faces should have been all tilting toward the small, warm intrusion of a living man standing in the mouth of their hall. But they did not come for him. They only watched and waited, with the terrible patience of a landlord who knows that the tenant cannot leave, that the tenant has nowhere to go but up a single stair into a town that belongs, floor and roof and every soul in it, to the ones below. They did not need to rush him. He was already counted. He had been counted the moment he set foot on the level floor, added to their sum the way every child carried down that stair had been added, and the only question that remained was one of timing, of when, of which cold winter his own lamp would go dark in its window while the sound passed slow beneath his floor. Merrick ran. He was not ashamed of it afterward, and he should not have been. He turned from the mouth of the hall, and he found the passage by touch, and he went up the worn slope in the dark faster than any careful man should climb a strange stair in total blackness, and behind him, he swore, the halls did not stay silent. Behind him the sound began, the settling, the shifting, the slow turning of a great weight, the same sound the town had heard beneath the church on winter nights for 50 years, and now Merrick knew what the sound was, because he had stood in the middle of it. It was not the springs, nor was it the rock. It was the ones below, all of them, in all those halls, turning at once toward the stair, the way a single body turns in its sleep, and beginning, without hurry, without any need for hurry, to follow him up. He came up into the grey before dawn, and the boy was still there. That is a small thing, but it mattered enormously to Merrick, and it should matter to us, because it is the one moment in the whole story where the arrangement of the hollow was tested, and a human being chose the harder thing. The bargain had been that the boy would leave at first light whether Merrick returned or not. First light was breaking. The lamp had burned low. And the boy, who had heard the sound rising up the spring mouth in the last hour of the night, who had felt the warm breath of the halls pushing up past him stronger and stronger as the thing below came climbing, who had every reason in the world and every permission from the bargain to take the lamp and run, had stayed. He had stayed at the lip of that stair with the sound coming, so that when Merrick came clawing up out of the blackness half out of his mind, there would be a hand to catch him and a face he knew, and a reason to keep climbing the last few feet into the open air. Whatever else the hollow was, whatever the town had allowed itself to become across 50 years of paying its rent in children, it had not entirely killed the thing in people that makes one of them wait at the top of a terrible stair for another. The boy waited, and because he waited, we have the count. They did not go back down. They did not seal the spring mouth either, though Merrick wanted to, because both men understood in the same wordless instant that sealing one mouth would do nothing. The wells breathed the same air. The whole valley was rotten with openings, sealed and unsealed, and the ones below had been coming up through them for 50 years to walk the streets at dusk and buy oil with old coin. You cannot seal a roof against the house beneath it. The two of them stood at the lip of the spring mouth in the first light, with the sound dying away below as the halls settled back into their patience, and Merrick said the thing that the boy had already known his whole life, and had never once heard said out loud by a grown man. He said that the town could not be saved. A town does not get saved from its own foundation, he said. He said the only thing left to do was to make sure that no more families came to live over the halls without knowing what they were living over, and that the one way to do that, the only way a census taker had the power to do, was to take Ashcombe Hollow off the map. This is the part of the story that can actually be checked, insofar as any of it can, and it is the part that gives the rest of it a cold weight that the tale alone would not carry, because Ashcombe Hollow really does vanish from the record in exactly this period. The early accounts exist, in the sense that a town of that name in that county was tallied through the middle of the century, and then, in the last decade of the 1800s, it stops being tallied. No fire is recorded, the creek never rose. No mine disaster of the kind that would ordinarily explain a town's death and be written up in the county paper and mourned. The town simply ceases to be counted, and the road that led to it ceases to be maintained, and, within a generation, the name has passed out of use so completely that people living 20 miles away will tell you there was never any town in that hollow at all, only the springs and the caves, and the bad ground that no one has ever been fool enough to build on. The surface facts and the buried story meet exactly here, at the erasure, and whatever you believe about the halls and the count, you are left with the plain and documented strangeness of a settled town that one decade is simply allowed to disappear, its people scattered or gone, its name struck through, its ground abandoned to the ash trees and the sinkholes and the cold. Merrick made it happen. He went to the county seat that winter, the winter of 1891, and he asked the clerk to strike the town, and when the clerk asked him why, he began to explain and then could not. Because there is no line in a county form for what he had counted in the halls, no column for a population that lives beneath the one you are sent to tally, no box to check for a town that is being quietly digested by its own foundations. So he said the thing that would fit on the form. He said the count could not be reconciled, and that the town should be considered depopulated, and he signed his name, and the clerk wrote it down, and Ashcombe Hollow left the world of maps and entered the world of stories, which is where you have found it tonight. What became of the people, the real people, the 300 souls who lived on the surface of the hollow in that last decade, is the question that the erasure does not answer and cannot answer, and it is the question that kept Merrick awake for the rest of his life. Some of them left, that much seems certain. The scattering of a town leaves traces, and there are families in the surrounding counties whose grandmothers came, they will tell you, from a place up in the hills that they do not like to name, a place they left as children in a hurry, in the winter, and were told never to speak of. Some of them left, but not all of them left, because a town does not empty cleanly, and the ones who stayed, the ones too old or too poor or too bound to the ground to run, those we do not hear from again at all. And the cold arithmetic that first drew Merrick down the stair offers only one answer for where the ones who stayed went, and it is the same answer the Hollow had been living with for 50 years. They went down, in the end, with the town dying above them, and no more children coming to pay the rent. The ones below simply collected the rest of what they were owed. They took the last of the surface for themselves, and the 2 floors of Ashcombe Hollow became 1 floor, and the roof was allowed to rot away into the ash trees, because a landlord who has finally taken possession of the whole house has no more need of a roof. Merrick lived another 30 years. He never counted another town. Whatever it is in a man that lets him believe a tally on a page is a fence between the ordered world and the dark. The halls had broken it in him, and he could not put a number to anything afterward without seeing, behind the number, the dim grey light and the even doors and the pale watchers turning slow toward him like grain in a changing wind. He left the census work. He moved east, away from the limestone country, to a flat and honest land, where the ground is solid all the way down, and a well strikes water where a well should. And there, in his last years, he wrote out the account that most of this story rests on, not for any newspaper, and not for any authority, because he had learned that there was no box on any form for what he knew, but simply so that it would exist somewhere outside his own failing head. He wrote it, the story goes, in a single long sitting, and he asked that it not be read until he was dead, and he was obeyed. We should be honest about what that account is, and what it is not. It is the testimony of one frightened man, written down decades after the night it describes, unwitnessed except by a boy whose own words never reached the page. It cannot be checked the way a birth record can be checked. No surveyor's map of the halls exists, and none ever will, because no one who could be persuaded to descend has ever come back up with a chain and a level and a steady enough hand to draw what is down there. So if you have listened this far, waiting for the moment when I produce the proof, the ledger page, the photograph, the government file with the seal on it, I will not insult you by inventing one. There is no such thing. There is a vanished town, and a rotten valley full of sealed and unsealed openings into a dark that no one has mapped, and the account of a man who said he went down into it and counted, and the long silence of the people who scattered out of that hollow in the winter and would never say why. But I will give you the things that keep the account from lying quietly down, the details that Merrick could not have known to invent, and that other mouths, in other years, repeated without ever having read his words. There is the matter of the old coin, Merrick wrote of it, the worn and ancient coin the pale buyers used at the store, older than the town, smoothed past reading. And there are, scattered through the antique trade of that whole region across the last century, coins that surface now and then from the old Ozark hollows that no collector can quite place. Blank silver, rubbed featureless, too soft and too old for any mint the catalogues know, turning up in the drawers of estate sales from houses whose families came. They always came, from up in the hills, from a place they did not name. That proves nothing. Worn coins are worn coins. But it is a strange thing for a frightened census-taker to have guessed, and it is a stranger thing for the guess to keep surfacing in old drawers 100 years on. There is the matter of the sound. The valley where Ashcombe Hollow stood is empty now, or as empty as such places ever are, and the few who go there, the hunters who cross it, and the rare, curious soul who reads a story like this one and drives out to stand in the bowl of the hills, come back saying the same thing the town said for 50 years. That on a still winter night, when the wind dies and the cold is deepest and the springs have drawn back into the rock, you can hear something underneath the ground, a settling, a shifting, a slow turning of a great weight, far below, in a place that has no business making any sound at all, because a cave full of nothing but water and time is a silent thing, and this is not a silent thing. That proves nothing either. The mind fills a quiet valley with whatever it fears. But the people who hear it did not grow up on the story, and they describe it, every time, in the same words the old woman of the older house used to a census taker 100 years ago, and they did not learn those words from her. And there is the matter of the ground itself, which is the one witness, remember, that never learned to lie. The hollow keeps opening. Sinkholes are ordinary in that country, the roof of an old cavern letting go and dropping a circle of trees and soil into the dark below, and no one who knows the limestone is surprised by them. But the openings in the old Ashcombe Bowl have a habit that unsettles even the men who study such things for a living. They open in the cold, they open in the deep of winter, when the water is lowest and the dry halls stand widest, the same season the town always dreaded, as though the ground grows hungry when the springs draw back and reaches up to take a little more of the surface for itself. A geologist would tell you there is a plain reason for it, something to do with frost and the water table and the mechanics of a collapse, and the geologist would very likely be right. But the people who live around the edges of that hollow do not build in the bowl, and they do not let their children play there in the winter, and if you ask them why, they will not give you the geologist's reason. They will give you a shorter one. They will tell you that the ground there is still paying out, and still owed, and that a debt that old does not forgive itself just because the town that signed it is gone. The boy who waited at the top of the stair deserves the rest of the telling, because his fate is the part that turns Ashcombe Hollow from one town's private horror into something larger, something that reaches out past the rim of that single rotten bowl and asks a harder question about the whole of that buried country. He did not stay in the region. Merrick saw to that. Whatever the census taker could no longer do for the town, he could still do for the one person who had waited for him in the dark, and the story is that he took the boy east with him when he left the limestone behind, out to the flat and solid land, and set him up in an honest trade far from any hollow, and treated him, for the rest of both their lives, as something between a son and a fellow survivor of a shipwreck that no one else on earth would ever believe had happened. The boy married. He had children of his own, up there on the good ground where the wells strike water where wells should, and he lived, by every account, a long and quiet life, and did the one thing that the arrangement of the hollow had been designed across 50 years to prevent. He let his family grow. He raised children over ground that owed nothing to anyone, and those children raised more, and the small pale count of the Alder name, which had been thinning out of the ledgers of a dying town for 2 generations, finally, up in the honest land, began to climb. That is the whole of the horror of Ashcombe Hollow, seen from the top of the stair. Not the halls, and not the pale watchers, and not the sound. The horror is the rule the halls enforced, the rule Merrick finally wrote out in plain words. The town above was not allowed to grow, and when you understand that rule, you understand that everything the ones below ever did, the taking of the children, the pale buyers, the empty street in the winter of 1889, all of it served that one cold purpose: to hold the surface at 300 souls forever, to keep the roof from ever rising off the house. A people who measure time in the slow dissolving of stone do not fear a town. They fear a town that spreads, that sends its children out to found more towns, that covers the whole rotten country in roofs and roads until there is no dark left anywhere, and no rent that can ever be collected again. The ones below were not feeding on the hollow out of hunger alone. They were pruning it, keeping it small, keeping it in its place, the way a man keeps a fire banked so that it warms his house without ever burning it down. And this is where the story stops being about one town, and where I have to be most careful with you, because this is the exact point at which a tale like this one wants to swell up past anything the ground can bear. There is a belief in that country, older than Ashcombe Hollow and wider than it, that the hollow was not the only house built over the halls, that the level corridors and the even doors run under more of the Ozarks than one valley, that they connect, that the whole soft limestone heart of that region is a single buried country with a single patient population, and that town after town on the surface has made the same unknowing bargain and paid the same slow rent. Each one held small, each one held down, each one quietly pruned whenever it dared to grow. In this belief, Ashcombe Hollow is not a monster. It is a symptom. It is simply the one town where a careful man happened to do the arithmetic before the ground could close over the answer, the one place where the pruning was caught in the act and written down. I do not ask you to believe that. I am not sure I believe it myself, and I have spent a long time now with this story. It is the kind of belief that outruns its evidence by 100 miles, the kind that takes a real strangeness, a rotten valley and a vanished town, and a frightened man's account, and builds on it a whole buried empire that the plain facts cannot support. The halls under Ashcombe Hollow, if they were ever there at all, may be nothing but the ordinary work of water and time, and the doors may be nothing but the shape stone falls into, and the population Merrick counted may be nothing but the population of his own terror, multiplying in the dark, the way our fears always multiply when the light is gone, and we are alone at the mouth of something vast. That is the honest possibility, and I will not take it away from you, because it may well be the true one. But there is the count. There is always, at the end of every attempt to explain this thing away, the count. A census taker went down a stair into the dark, a man whose whole life was built on the sober faith that a thing you can number is a thing you can trust, and he tried to number the ones below, and he could not, because there were more of them in a single hall than there had ever been people in the town, and the hall did not end, and the halls did not end, and he came back up a man who never trusted a number again. Whatever was down there, it was more than a frightened man invents. It was more than one valley should be able to hold, and it was, by every telling that survives, still growing. There is one more thread worth pulling before we come up out of this, and it is the hardest thread of all, because it concerns not the halls or the count, but the ones themselves, the pale watchers in the doorways, and what the various accounts across the years actually said about them when pressed. The families of the Hollow were reluctant witnesses, and the reluctance shows, because no two of them describe the ones below in quite the same way, and the disagreement is itself the most telling thing about the descriptions. A man who invents a monster invents it whole and keeps it consistent. A crowd of frightened people describing a real thing they each saw only once, in the dark, by a light that was not a light, will contradict one another in exactly the ways the Hollow's witnesses contradicted one another. Some said the ones below were tall and thin past any natural thinness, stretched, the accounts said, like a thing that had been grown in a space too narrow for it, and had lengthened to fit. Others said they were small, bent, folded down close to the worn floors, moving low along the walls. The old woman of the older house, who had gone down as a girl, would say only that they were pale, and that the pallor was not the pallor of sickness, but the pallor of something that had simply never once been touched by the sun, across a life so long that the very idea of the sun had worn away from it. And nearly all of them, when they could be brought to speak at all, came back to the same detail that the storekeeper had come back to, the one thing the disagreeing accounts agreed on. The hands. Too many fingers, or too long, or too pale. No one could ever afterward decide which, only that the eye slid off them the way a foot slides off wet stone, and that a person who looked too long at the hands of the ones below came away from the looking changed, quieter, older, as though some small warm thing in them had been counted and carried down. The colder version of the belief takes all of this and turns it into the worst shape it can hold. In the colder version, the reason the descriptions do not agree is that the ones below are not one kind of thing at all. They are every child the Hollow ever carried down that stair. At every stage of the slow change the dark works on a body kept too long out of the light. The freshly taken still look almost like the children they were. The ones taken generations ago do not look like anything a surface word can hold. And somewhere in the halls, in the dim grey light, growing quietly between them, are the ones taken in between, at every point along that terrible road, a whole population arranged not by family or by rank, but by how long each of them has belonged to the dark. It is a nursery, in the colder telling, and it is a graveyard, and it is neither, because the ones in it are not being raised and are not dead. They are only being kept, and the count of them only ever climbs. If you go looking for Ashcombe Hollow today, you will have a hard time of it, and the difficulty itself is part of the story. There is no sign at the turn-off, because there is no longer any road to turn off toward. The county maintained the road for a while after the town was struck from the record, out of habit more than need, and then it stopped, and the woods came in the way woods do, and now the old grade is a line of slightly younger trees running up a hollow, visible in the winter when the leaves are down, invisible for the rest of the year. A few people who care about such things have walked that grade up into the bowl of the hills. They are not many. The country there does not welcome walking, and the local families, the ones whose grandmothers came down out of the hills in a hurry and would not say why, have a way of steering strangers gently toward other, prettier valleys. The ones who make it up into the bowl describe a place quieter than any ordinary abandoned place. An old town site, even a long-dead one, keeps a shape for a century or more. The lines of the streets survive as low ridges. The cellar holes stay open, square mouths in the ground where houses stood, slowly filling with leaves. The church foundation, being stone, outlasts everything, a low grey rectangle in the brush that says a gathering place stood here. All of that is at Ashcombe Hollow, and none of it is a surprise. What the visitors find surprising, what they mention every time, is the cellar holes. There are too few of them for a town that once held 300 souls. A town that size leaves a field of open cellar mouths, dozens of them, a whole pocked landscape of the places where lives were kept. The Ashcombe Bowl has only a scattering, and the visitors, standing in the quiet with the low church foundation grey in the brush before them, come to the uneasy thought that a cellar hole is only open if the house above it fell in and left the hole behind, and that a house whose family went down the spring mouth and never came back would have no reason to fall in at all. It would simply stand empty until the roof rotted and the walls leaned and the whole of it sank quietly and closed itself over, leaving no open mouth, no square in the ground, nothing to count. The missing cellar holes are not proof of anything, but they are the kind of absence that gets into a person, standing alone in that bowl in the winter cold, and does not easily come out again. The spring mouth is still there. That is the one feature of the old hollow that a visitor can find without much trouble, because the water still comes up out of the rock behind the church foundation, cold and steady and clear, the same flood that drew the first families in the 1840s. It comes up in the corner of a wide throat of stone, exactly as Merrick described it, and the rest of the throat still goes down into the dark, dry and level-floored, with a worn slope leading away below the reach of the daylight. People stand at the lip of it. They do not, as a rule, go down. The warm air still moves up out of it, even in the hardest cold, warm against a visitor's face when the whole surface world is frozen, and it still carries a smell that the ones who notice it struggle to name and then, when they read the old account, recognize with a lurch. The smell of too many people shut up together in a closed room. They stand at the lip. They feel the warm breath of the halls come up past them. And nearly all of them, sooner or later, turn around and walk back down the old road grade a good deal faster than they came up it, and they do not talk much on the way, and they do not, afterward, go back. I want to be fair to the plain explanation here, because it is a good one, and it deserves the same hearing as the story. A limestone spring cave breathes. This is ordinary cave physics, well understood, no mystery in it at all. The great mass of rock holds a steady temperature year-round, and in the winter that steady warmth flows out of the cave mouth as a current of air that feels almost hot against skin, chilled by the surface, cold, and it carries the damp, close, mineral smell of the deep rock, which a frightened imagination is free to call the smell of a crowded room if it wishes to. The sound has a plain explanation too, the shifting of water and the settling of stone, and the small collapses that go on forever in the guts of any living cave. And the sinkholes that open in the cold are, as I have said, very likely a matter of frost and water tables and the honest mechanics of a roof that finally lets go. Every single strange thing about Ashcombe Hollow has an ordinary explanation waiting beside it, and if you laid them all out in a row you could walk down that row and dismiss the whole story item by item and go home and sleep well, and you would not be a fool for doing it. You would, in fact, be doing exactly what the reasonable, sober part of the mind is for. But you would have to walk past the count to do it, and you would have to walk past the town that really did vanish, cleanly, in the decade the story says it vanished, with no fire and no flood to explain it. You would have to walk past the families in the surrounding counties who really will not name the place their grandmothers came from. And you would have to walk past the fact that when strangers who never heard the tale stand at the lip of that spring mouth and feel the warm breath come up, something in them, some old animal part that is older than reason and was keeping us alive long before we learned to count anything, tells them without a single word to turn around and go, and they listen and they go. I want to go back, before we finish, to the man at the county seat, to the winter of 1891 and the clerk, and the moment Merrick asked for a whole town to be struck from the earth. Because there is a detail in that scene that I held back at the start, and it is the detail that has stayed with me longest, and I think it is the truest thing in the entire account. When the clerk asked Merrick why the town should be erased, and Merrick began to explain and could not, and finally gave the answer that would fit on the form, the clerk did something that clerks are not supposed to do. He did not simply write it down and reach for the next paper. He looked up, and he asked Merrick a question that was not on any form, a quiet question, the kind one frightened man asks another when the door is closed and there is no one else to hear. He asked whether the census taker had counted them, whether he had gotten a number, not the town, them, the ones below. And Merrick understood in that instant that the clerk already knew, that the clerk had always known, that Ashcombe Hollow was not the first hollow to be quietly struck from the county's records in this way, and would not be the last, and that somewhere in that same building, in a locked drawer that no census would ever tally, there was a small and growing list of the places a careful man was not supposed to build. Merrick told him the truth. He said that he had tried to count them, and that the count could not be finished, because there were more of them than the town had ever held, and because the halls did not end. And the clerk nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when you have confirmed the worst thing he already believed. And he wrote, across the top of the form, a single word that was not depopulated, and was not abandoned, and was not any of the tidy words the county used for a town that had simply died. He wrote the word full, and then he closed the ledger over it, and he told Merrick to go home, and to go far, and never to count the limestone country again. And Merrick took the advice, all of it, and lived 30 more years on solid ground, and never did. That is the story of Ashcombe Hollow, a town founded in good faith by families who did not know what they were building over, a rent paid in children across 50 years, in the cold, down a worn stair behind a stone church, to a landlord older than the maps, a population beneath the valley that grew as the town above it shrank, held forever at the same small number, pruned each winter so the roof would never rise, a census-taker who did the arithmetic no one had dared to do, and went down to prove it, and came up unable to trust a number for the rest of his life, and a town struck from the record with a single word, full, and given back to the ash trees and the sinkholes and the cold, where it has stayed, quiet and rotten and patient, ever since. I have told it to you as honestly as I know how to tell it, which means I have told you the plain explanations right alongside the terrible one, and I have not hidden from you that the whole thing rests on the account of one frightened man and the long silence of the people who ran. You are free to take the sober road down that row of ordinary explanations, and to leave the halls behind you as a fable, a thing the dark of a bad valley grew to feed on the fear of the people living over it. That road is open. Reasonable people walk it. I have walked it myself, more than once, in the daylight, and found it a good and solid road. But I will leave you with the thing that always turns me back around, and then I will let you go. It is not the count, in the end, though the count is the heart of it. It is the arithmetic that started the whole thing, the simple, sober, undramatic arithmetic that a careful man did at a plank table in a general store, comparing a column of births against a column of the living, and finding that the two would not close. Because that arithmetic did not require a single ghost to be frightening. It did not need the halls, or the pale watchers, or the warm breath of the wells. It needed only 2 lists of names and the nerve to lay them side by side. And when Merrick laid them side by side, the plain and provable fact that stared back at him was that a town had been quietly losing its children for 50 years, on a schedule, in the cold, and refilling itself from somewhere no daylight ever reached, and calling it the weather, and looking away. You do not need to believe in what lives under the Ozarks to be chilled by that. You need only to believe that a community can agree without ever once saying it out loud, to feed its own future into the dark in exchange for being left alone. That the agreement can last for generations. That it can hide inside the ordinary rhythms of baptisms and boots and seed bought in the spring, until one careful outsider does the sum that everyone else has spent 2 lifetimes refusing to do. The halls may be water and time. The watchers may be terror in the shape of men. But the arithmetic is real, and the arithmetic is the part that erased a town. And the arithmetic is waiting, patient as limestone, in more places than one, for the next careful person with the nerve to lay the 2 lists side by side and see what will not close. So, the next time you stand in a quiet valley in the deep of winter, when the wind has died and the cold is at its hardest, and the ground beneath your boots is stiller than any ground has a right to be, do not listen for the sound. Listen instead for the silence, where a sound should be. Count the houses, and then count the children, and then count the graves, and lay the 3 of them side by side. And if the numbers close, go home, and sleep well, and thank whatever you thank that you were born over solid ground. But if they do not close, if there are children who were born and never buried and never grown, if the town is somehow never any smaller than it was, then step back off that ground, quietly, the way you would step back from the lip of a stair you could not see the bottom of. Because a debt that old does not forgive itself. And the ground, remember, is the one witness that never learned how to lie. Ashcombe Hollow is not on any map. The road is grown over, the spring still runs cold behind a fallen church, and the warm breath still rises out of the dark, and the sinkholes still open in the winter when the ground grows hungry and reaches up to take a little more. And somewhere below the ash trees, in the level halls, behind the even doors, in the dim grey light that is not a lamp, a count that no census will ever finish goes on, quietly, in the cold, and grows.